Now that the hooter had blown to announce the first half-hour break in the day, the workmen appeared to be invested with a new vitality. Food boxes clicked open, tea gurgled into tankard lids, benches dragged against the sawdust-covered floor, feet scraped, mouths opened and closed, jaws moved incessantly up and down. The breakfast had begun. Yayan watched one man with amazement. He thrust his food savagely into his mouth and rammed it down his throat with his fingers. Another attacked a cold, greasy sausage with penknife and fork as though he held a grudge against it. Someone made a loud sucking noise as he drained his tea and belched without apology. As soon as the first pangs of hunger were satisfied, the men began to talk to one another. To Yayan it seemed as though they all conversed simultaneously. The noise was akin to a corner of a fairground. He carefully unwrapped his sandwiches and rolled the greaseproof paper into a ball. So far, no one had asked him any questions. The relief he felt was accompanied with a certain tenseness. They would surely cross-examine him before long, he thought. The best thing to do would be to avoid encouraging them to ask questions. He lowered his eyes, concentrated them on the sandwiches. He pecked at his food, self-conscious of each movement he made. His hand shook as he raised the tankard to his lips. A drop of tea fell onto the table. Hastily he placed his elbow over it and his heart almost stopped beating. A high-pitched voice spoke from the other side of the table. Nice council houses they're building on the old Morva Tump. What do you think of them, Owen? Nothing much. Bit small they are, if you ask me. Chap would have to cock one leg out of the bedroom window for to put his trousers on in the morning. Yayan looked up. The twins were talking. Thomas nudged him. Here they go. Damn and blast, the terrible twins. Trying to be clever, is it, Owen? The first twin was speaking. Well, let me tell you, they may be a bit small, but they're all right for us workers. A nice little parlour they got. A parlour, indeed. Is that important, then? I should blinking well say so, the other brother returned. Every house ought to have a parlour where a fella can go to enjoy a smoke on a Sunday afternoon. Why, man, a house without a parlour is like a pub without no dominoes. And then someone began to discuss Welsh nicknames and their origin. Why was Idris Great Thoughts so called? And Laius Shakespeare? Who gave the name 3/8 to Enoch Price, the yard labourer, and Elastic Belly to Tom Evans, landlord of the Barley Mow? Why call PC Harry Thomas Harry Chew Tobacco when he had never been known to chew tobacco? And why Gomer Determination and Johnny Preacher? I'll tell you the story of Gomer Determination, one volunteered. The others waited, settling themselves comfortably into their seats. A one for his beer was Gomer. Couldn't pass a pub without calling in to wet his whistle. But he was hell of a tanker, as you know. The speaker rested his elbow on the table. His eyes sparkled and he obviously enjoyed the role of storyteller. His old woman, Mary Jane Straight, she was called Straight, not because she was honest or anything like that, but because she was as stiff as a plank. Well, she was always on to Gomer to give up the booze. Don't call in the pubs on your way home, Gomer, she used to say to him every night, regular as the clock. Give up the old beer stuff, man. Well, Gomer thought as much of his Mary Jane as he did of the beer. A real toss-up it was between them. So one night he made up his mind to chuck the beer and chuck it for good. Determination, that's what you need, Gomer, Mary Jane had told him, and Gomer remembered what the old woman had said. He was walking home with my brother one night from the Delice Tin Works after the 2 to 10 shift. They passed the Crown and Anchor, first pub on the road just outside the works. Gomer saying to my brother, Determination, that's what I need, Edgar, my boy. Determination, not beer. The joke brought a roar of laughter from the men. Someone applauded. When the last note of the 9 o'clock hooter faded, all the men were back on their jobs. The silent foundry awakened again. From within came the growling of the cranes. Stove doors were raised and bogies groaned over the dust-covered rails. Moulders who had been waiting for the use of the cranes shouted to the crane men, each claiming priority over the other. The crusher was started. It snorted and grunted, wheezed and choked, loudly and asthmatically. The frightened seagull circled above the canteen and then flew further inland through the purple haze. Bull grinned slyly and winked at Thomas. Ieuan worked assiduously at the bench, listening carefully to Thomas's instruction as the apprentice showed him how to ram and part a core box. Within the next half hour, he had completed 6 small rectangular cores when Reg and Charlie appeared. Hands in pockets, cigarette dangling from the corner of his mouth, Reg saluted Bull with a toss of the shoulder. The 2 cronies sat down on the edge of the bench. Abraham frowned at their approach, but said nothing. "How's the kid shaping, Bull?" Charlie surveyed the 6 cores which had been placed carefully on a steel plate, ready for drying in the stove. He picked one up, pressed it hard between his fingers. "Should ram 'em harder, Ieuan," he remarked as the core crumbled into dust. "Like iron, Ieuan. See what I mean? Bit more elbow grease on the job, that's what you need." He took a second core and ground it between his fingers. No, son, must ram 'em harder." Ieuan stepped to the plate and pushed Charlie vigorously when the improver attempted to break another core. "Cheeky little bastard," Reg called from his seat on the bench. "What's the game?" He leapt forward, pretending to make a grab at the plate, and simultaneously nipped his cigarette end into Ieuan's dungaree pocket. There was a smell of burning cloth. "Pwah, what a stink!" Reg held his nose. "Who's smoking old rope?" "Not me," Bull grinned. "Nor me." Thomas had seen the occurrence. "Look out, Ieuan, your pocket's burning." Ieuan whipped a hand to his side. A neat round hole appeared in his jacket pocket, and the lighted cigarette end dropped to the floor. Charlie laughed. "Funny, I thought I smelled something burning. Instinct, that's what I call it. Instinct, and a sensitive snot." Goaded into a temper, Ieuan picked up a core and suddenly aimed it at the improver's head. Charlie ducked smartly. The smile disappeared. His eyes narrowed, and he flung himself at the boy. With a quick movement, he knocked his cap from his head, and as Ieuan stooped to retrieve it, Bull and Reg snatched a fistful of compo and threw it down his neck. Abraham, hearing the scuffing, glanced around. He saw Bull hurriedly wipe his hands. Then he noticed Ieuan's plight. A bucket of water stood by his side. The charge hand grabbed it by the handle and swung it back. "Get out," he shouted at the top of his voice. Get out, the 3 of you, before I drown you." "Duh, do you hear me?" He was livid. The 3 backed towards the compo shed, and then, as they reached it, the door of the steel shop was dragged open, and Lew, the foreman, stood framed in the doorway. "What's going on here?" Lew demanded wrathfully. "Abraham!" The charge hand lowered the bucket. Ieuan, petrified with fear, hung his head, not daring to look up into the foreman's angry face. Bull had swiftly returned to the bench and was working more energetically than ever. Lew's eyes focused on the broken cores. He swept them aside with his boot. "Who's responsible for this?" he asked. "Bull?" Bull paused, rammer in hand. "Yes, sir." "These cores, did you break them?" "Why, no, sir. I've been busy here all morning, sir." That's a good one, the foreman said sarcastically. It's the first time I've heard you've been busy. He addressed Abraham. I'd like to know just what's been happening here, Abraham, and what's up with the new lad. Has anyone been throwing compo again? And these cores, how come they're smashed? Abraham exhaled loudly. You'd better ask Bowen and his mate. They were here when it happened. Please, Mr. Davis. Yayan trembled. Yes, what have you to say for yourself? The foreman stared hard at him. It was an accident. I kicked against the plate and they tipped over. And I suppose they fell down your neck, eh? What's that stuff all over your collar? Oh no, Reg Bowen threw. Reg Bowen, it was an accident, Mr. Davis. That's enough. Leo spun round to the two improvers who were crossing the floor towards the foundry door. If I hear that either of you has been up to his tricks again, there'll be trouble. I'll get rid of the pair of you, I'm telling you straight. This lad is paid to learn a trade, not to be pestered by hoodlums. The improvers slunk through the doorway. Yayan watched them as they slid the door to. They waited until the foreman's back was turned, and then Reg held up his fist. We'll get you for this, he mouthed silently. Yayan moved slowly from the latrine. A little distance away, he saw an old man standing by a heavy iron barrow filled with steel borings. The old man's gnarled hands were protected by strips of red rubber tubing. He coughed wheezingly and tapped his chest. For a moment, a look of bewilderment crossed his face. His right hand strayed to his forehead. He drew it across to his right ear. He smiled as his fingers closed over a cigarette stub. Flicking the burnt end, he placed the butt in his mouth. He searched in his waistcoat pockets and withdrew a blackened matchstick. This he struck on the barrow handle and bent low over the capped flame. With knees crossed, he sat on the handle and inhaled deeply, blowing out the smoke with a sigh of satisfaction. Yayan greeted him as he went by. The old man's face creased into a warm smile. Hello, boy, he hailed. Come over by here for a minute. Yayan drew his jacket tightly about him, approached. Good morning, boy Bach. A new face you are around this way, aren't you? When did you start? This morning, Well, what a place to come to indeed. Wiser you would have been if you'd stayed in school, my boy. The old man took another puff at his cigarette. That's what I tell all the boys who come here, he continued, but they don't seem to care. But there, perhaps I shouldn't say such daft things. There's no money to be earned in school, and I'm thinking you're anxious to get a little bit for to take home to your mum and dad. All the same, this is no place for a slight little fella like you. Though you might be a lot better off than I was when I was your age. In them days, things were terrible hard. Aye, indeed. The old man uncrossed his legs. When I was a nipper, we were so poor that my dad couldn't afford to have my boots mended. Had to be carried to work when it was raining. That's a fact for you. However, times have changed a bit, thank goodness. It's better now than in them days. Indeed it is. Indeed it is. Yayan stood as though in a spell. The old man's eyes held him, and he could not drag himself away. Suddenly, as if from nowhere, a bowler-hatted man in a belted raincoat appeared before them. What's the meaning of this, Robert? Is this why we pay you? He demanded, staring at the old man. You've been sitting here for the last 10 minutes. I've been watching you from the pattern shop. Startled, old Robert got up from the barrow handle. In his confusion, he dropped the cigarette into the mud. He stammered. The manager turned to Yayan, who had been too frightened to move while he remonstrated with old Robert. And what are you supposed to be doing? I'm working in the coast shop, sir. Well, get back there and stay there. We don't pay you for standing idle. Ieuan's feelings revolted at the manager's tone. He felt a fierce resentment against the manner in which he had spoken to old Robert. What right had he to shout at a man old enough to be his father? A man who had worked in a foundry all his life and helped to build it into the huge concern it was. Give a man a uniform and he ceases to be a man, someone had once said. How right it was. This man had no uniform, but he had been given authority over everyone in the foundry, which was the same thing. And because he had been given this, he thought he had the right to speak disrespectfully to old men like Robert. Well, what are you waiting for? The manager's voice broke in on Ieuan's thoughts. He turned and began to walk away. But once again, his mind dwelt on the old labourer who had spoken to him in such a friendly way.